just talk loud. When you say it in Oxford, maybe.
I've been screaming all day long, so I decided to do it too. So, my name is Louise Rome. I am a professor of political science here at PSU, and I also am a member of the CIDOR Lecture Series Committee. And this is the last one of this year's series. And as some of you might know, this year's theme focused on building justice in our communities and our world today and beyond. What is social justice? What would that look like? Who benefits from social justice and who benefits from resisting it? So our lectures focused on broad spectrum of justice issues, and yes, it is depressing, but this is very dear to my heart too. We are really excited to have Professor Lyon joining us tonight. Dr. Lyon is a professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire. She is author of U.S. Politics and the United Nations, co-author of the United Nations 75 Years Promoting Peace, Human Rights and Development, and the United Nations in the 21st Century. She also co-edited Pope Francis as a Global Actor, where Politics and Theology Meet, Religion, and Politics in Global Society. Dr. Lyon is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Global Governance and faculty fellow for the Office of Senior Vice Provost, Engagement and Faculty Development. We are so thrilled to have her. Please welcome.
Check?
Yes,
okay, that means I can't move.
yeah.
I will try. Felice, thank you so much. I too am honored and just absolutely delighted to be here. The CIDOR Lecture Series is something that we have at University of New Hampshire too, and it's just a wonderful commitment to social justice. And I am delighted to come and talk to you today about building global justice. I will tell you, I feel like it's a little odd that we made, I think it was 8 months ago that we decided to do this. And the International Criminal Court decided to issue a warrant for Vladimir Putin a couple weeks ago. And so it's weird. I get a little worried when I get asked to speak about things. I'm afraid sometimes that things are going to happen in the world around those particular events because they seem to correlate. I know there's no causation. But it's a really interesting time in global history and a really interesting time to talk about the evolution of global justice. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to the questions that I'm thinking about for this and then how we're going to go about addressing the questions. So for me, the world, and I have a short list, this is a short list in front of you of situations of what we would call mass atrocities that we have seen in the 21st century. We know that the 20th century was one, and by one estimate, Routledge at 1995 has an incredibly large number of casualties from mass atrocities. These are atrocities in which human beings have caused horrendous violence upon other human beings, right? So this is probably, in my world, the most pressing issue. If we can fix this, think of all the lives that one can save. And so the question for me is, how do we end this? How do we fix this? And part of that is thinking about the justice component, and we're going to talk a little bit at the end about what justice is, and there are different conceptions of justice. We tend to traditionally think of justice as punishment. There's an expanding view of what justice means, and we will get there. One of the things I want to talk about is what tools do we have available to us? And so I'm a scholar of the UN. Felice went through all the books that I've written on the UN. I spent a lot of time looking at international institutions, what they can do and what they can't do. Most of them are very flawed organizations, so I don't come here with a very idealistic perspective, but a much more realistic perspective about what they can and cannot do. And then finally, we have to understand that when oftentimes we talk about law or justice, it's a legal discussion. It gets very technical, international law is very technical. This is one of creating intersections between politics and law. These are highly political, whether it's the creation of something like the International Criminal Court, whether or not it's calling Vladimir Putin to account. These are highly political, not necessarily legal as we would think about it within domestic context, inside the country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the ideas. Some of these things have happened because of ideas. If we go back 100 years, the ideas that we have now about what is just, what countries can and cannot do to their civilian populations have grown. And in fact, we have good news there. We have seen what we call normative development, ideas about what is off limits for countries, for their own population, but also during war. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history because you can't understand the situation that we're dealing with, whether or not it's Vladimir Putin today, or Myanmar, or the many lists that I had up there, without understanding a little bit about how we got here. We're also going to talk about justice. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about times in which the international community has come together and said, all right, we're going to put together something that looks like justice. And we're going to talk about their successes, and we're going to talk a little bit about the deficiencies and the failures, because they are not perfect, again. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about war and Russia. So I think that we'll end there, and then hopefully have about 20 minutes for discussion. I think that's adequate. All right. We cannot begin our conversation without this key concept, sovereignty. Sovereignty comes to us through international law with a treaty that's created in what is now Germany in 1648. Sovereignty means that countries, if you are a country, you have supreme authority domestically. Sovereignty means that other countries cannot intervene in your domestic politics. Now we know some countries are more sovereign than others, but international law, the pillar of international law is sovereignty, exclusive legal jurisdiction domestically. So we're going to talk about the emergence and the evolution of this notion of sovereignty. When we talk about the UN, it is both a bastion, a protector of sovereignty, and a threat to sovereignty. So we have these paradoxes that we'll look at. So let's begin the story by understanding you are not supposed to interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. Countries cannot do that. International organizations cannot do that. The UN cannot do that. The European Union is not supposed to do that. There's like this one little piece where the UN has the EU has supranational power, but we'll just table that for a minute. But you're not supposed to do that. So there is this barrier in terms of engaging in trying to hold people of other countries account for what they're doing in their countries. Now, quickly, international law is law between countries. It really, and for over 100 years, it's law that regulates the relationship between countries, that space, not inside countries. It is not some supranational laws that are supposed to drip down into countries' legal codes. That's not the case. International law by countries, for countries, regulating countries' behavior with other countries, right? They have obligations, countries have obligations, and they have rights. It is very recent and very incremental that you can hold individuals, like a country's leader, accountable for international law. So the jurisdiction, and again, this is law, the jurisdiction usually doesn't go to people. And so that becomes really relevant when we talk about someone like Vladimir Putin. All right, this is supposed to be really simple. Like if I was in class, I would say, okay, this is a lecture on international law and global justice, right? Create the laws, implement them, done, right? But this is not a simple or easy story or a simple or easy task. For one, domestic law can be highly problematic, and I'm going to talk about this when I talk about Germany and genocide in Germany under the Nazi regime. Oftentimes, if we leave it to countries themselves to administer law, it often is not done in a way that is just, that is equitable, that is fair, that holds the people who are in power accountable to everyone else. And so we have terms for this. One of them is victor's justice. So whoever wins the presidency, wins the parliament, wins the war, and takes over, like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, they get to write the rules and they get to say what's just, right? So there's a problem here. In addition, many countries don't actually have capacity. so what we call post-conflict states. Sub-Saharan Africa, Rwanda, again, is a great example, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But after these horrific crimes, countries are often leveled. We think post-Nazi Germany, the country itself is in shambles. Most intellectuals have left. They were the first ones out if they could get out, so you don't have attorneys. You don't have a professional class that can be able to process people in an illegal system. So it's highly problematic in that we don't have law really at the global level, and we don't have capacity at the domestic level in many, many cases. All right, let's go back to the very beginning. The very beginning is really interesting to me, and it's actually fascinating for those of you who want to study this. Countries early on raised their hands and actually said, we need to have some rules, even under the most savage conditions of war. Countries actually said this. We need to put some parameters. Now, some countries came willing, some countries came kicking. It's what we call civil society. In this case, the International Red Cross was a huge part of this, saying there need to be some rules. And so we get these documents called the Geneva Conventions, and they are conventions. They are signed over a period of several decades, where countries agreed to abide by certain rules. One rule was, let's not target civilians. You're not supposed to deliberately target civilian populations. War should be combatants against combatants, armies against armies. Not children, not people in the village, not women, not non-combatants. Another one, which was very strategic for most countries, and they like this, is that prisoners and people who are wounded on the battlefield have certain rights. They should be treated honorably. Medical personnel should come and help them. And it doesn't matter which side you're fighting on, you should have access. So there were some limited rules basically saying there are things that you can do during war that is criminal, that are beyond the borders. Even in this horrific moment, there were boundaries, and you can have war crimes. All right, so we have this body of law from the Geneva Conventions, and then we have, immediately following World War II, a whole flurry of activity around this particular situation. We have the creation of the United Nations in 1945. We have the International Court of Justice, which was actually pre-existing. Countries needed a venue to sue each other, right? If the United States and Canada have a dispute over fishing rights, up around up on the coast, they didn't want to have to go to war. They wanted to have an option to sue each other. So the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which is in the Netherlands, in a place called The Hague, it's the fence, but in The Hague, pre-exists the UN, and then the United Nations folds it in. It's a place for countries to sue countries. Again, not individuals, not leaders. Countries can sue countries. And then what we see up until the creation of what we call the International Criminal Court, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is ad hoc tribunals, which means something really bad happened here. This is genocidal Germany. We need to hold these people account. We need to set up a trial. And so they basically build it from scratch. They did that once with the Nuremberg trials. They do it after Rwanda and the genocide there in '94. They do it again in Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia in 1999. They have to build it all over again. Well, what rules, what judges, we have to find buildings, the whole thing. And then they decided, okay, we need to have a permanent place where we can hold people account, which now is what they call the International Criminal Court, the ICC, also in The Hague. So if you ever go to The Hague, it's the kind of seat of international law. One of the things that I just want to hint there right now, please note, and we'll talk about this more in a bit, the International Court has limited membership. The United States is not a member, Russia is not a member, China is not a member. We can talk about that during Q&A. All right, quickly want to point out the UN's, as it's created, its principles. You don't have to read all this, but you'll see almost instantly this contradiction. Look at this. Sovereign equalities of states. It codifies sovereignty. It says if you join this organization, you're sovereign. People can't interfere in your domestic politics. Territorial integrity, political independence. Yes, you're going to be fine. Nobody's going to meddle in your business. We are not a global government. The UN is not a global government. We're not there to meddle. Non-intervention. Although then we get into, but you should settle your disputes peacefully. Do not go to war. And then respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, right? So there is a bit of cross purposes, right? And in fact, the notion of human rights was so controversial during the San Francisco conference in 1945 when they were creating it, that they tabled them. They said, okay, we got to create this organization. We're not going to work on human rights right now. And then they brought it back, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, champions this. So it's Eleanor Roosevelt that kind of brings in human rights, as well as others as well. All right, so I want to quickly give you, and most of you know this, but a quick review of the UN, because it's helpful to understand the tools and the impediments to global justice by doing this. First of all, it's an organization of many, many organizations. This is the most simple, bare bones approach that we can get to. But remind yourself that the institution, it is an institution of institutions, the one institution that has capacity to enforce its resolutions is the UN Security Council. It is made up of 15 members, and I'm going to go forward and I'll come back. 5 permanent members. Again, there's an element of victor's justice here. I'm just going to tell you this. These 5 permanent members that constantly sit in that UN Security Council that is primarily tasked with securing international peace and security were the victors of World War II. Right? So Germany is not there, Italy is not there, Japan is not there. They wrote the rules, put them in concrete, and we live with them today. Most will point out that this is an antiquated and problematic permanent 5, P5. All to remember that those 5 countries have veto capacity. If they don't like anything, they can kill it. It takes 1 veto, right? So for something to pass, you need 9 yes, no vetoes. Very important. It does have geographic representation, but many will claim not enough, and we can talk about Security Council and those issues there. Going back, the General Assembly has a membership with all countries that are members of the UN. They all have a vote. Their resolutions are merely suggestions to the world. However, with the Ukraine situation, there's some really interesting things that are coming out of General Assembly, and please ask me about them in Q&A if we have some time, because they have exerted themselves in a really interesting way. The Secretary General, I will remind you, is more secretary than general, right? So the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, is legally, by the UN Charter, required to be a neutral. Article 99 says you cannot be unneutral. You have to be a neutral, and he is more administrator than general, right? So the powers in that particular office are really, really limited. Truthfully, the first Secretary General said it was the most impossible job in the world because great power servicing is what that job does. Then the International Court of Justice, which was folded in, and we'll talk a little bit about the Human Rights Council in a bit. All right. Let's move on to Germany and what was going on in Germany. This is a tough particular case, but it's a very illustrative case. When we talk about law and justice after Nazi Germany, I have a whole list up here. Internally and externally, inside the country and outside of the country. And this is a really tough sentence to say. What the Nazis did was not illegal. So the list up here, within Germany, the list up here is all of the laws that were passed by the Nazi regime legalizing what they did. Now remember, there are Geneva Conventions on the books that say you cannot target another, while you're in war, you can't target another country's civilian population. So for people in Poland, there are protections because it's another country, but not within Germany. So it's not illegal at the global level. For the most part, genocide as we know it today, there are no provisions against that in international law in 1945. And what's going on domestically within Germany falls under sovereignty, and the German government, under the Nazi regime, has passed laws that legalize those actions. However, and I don't know why these are flying in, but I remember this from before. I hate it when they fly in. When we come to afterwards, after the Holocaust, and the US and the Soviets liberate much of Germany, there was debate. It was political. Do we hold these people account? In fact, there was debate against them. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister at the time, didn't want to hold trials. He wanted to hang all of them. He just said, let's round them up and hang them. These people don't deserve a trial. Right? Very Churchill, right? We're not surprised that Churchill didn't think that. Interestingly enough, in the United States, Truman and Stalin want trials. But what these trials look like, what they will be tried for, is very difficult. One of the really interesting things about the Nazi Germany regime is that they were so meticulous with their record keeping. So when we talk about law and implementation of law and requiring, holding people accountable within law, evidence is an incredibly important part of that, right? You can't just accuse someone. There's a legal process. You have to bring evidence forward. Well, the Nazis were very good at documenting their crimes. And so it was a fairly clear case to bring evidence forward. So one of the challenges that we have at this particular moment in time, and there's a quote here that's attributed to Stalin, but most people say, no, Stalin never said this. We haven't quite figured out who said this. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. Some people say the death of one is a crime, right? You can be held on murder account, but if you kill millions, it's just a statistic, right? So we have this moment in time, is that going to be true? Is that going to be the situation? Nuremberg trials are set up by the Allies, and in some ways they build on the Geneva Conventions, and in some ways they create law that wasn't really there. So let me talk about that for just a second. Of those crimes, they have 24 indicted, 22 stand trial. So let's just talk about those particular crimes. So they have war crimes, those had already been established by the Geneva Conventions. Crimes against peace, again, that's an international crime, country to country. Country was an aggressor, Germany was the aggressor. There's a new one that they add, and this is highly problematic when you talk to attorneys, international law attorneys, because they just created it, right? It's something called crime against humanity. And the crime against humanity that they accuse those Nazis of is a little bit different. It's changed today, but they add it to the books. They add it and they hold it up as a measuring tape and try the Germans on this. So one of the things that's really interesting, so this is a success story, right? A limited one, you've got, not even 24 that are held accountable for the death of 6 million. But there was conversation. How do we try? How do we try everyone associated with this? So they defined it as a crime of leadership, and they were going to hold the leaders accountable. That's what they could do at that particular moment. There is something really interesting, and when I talk about ideas and the progress of ideas, we have to talk about Ralph Lemkin. So Lemkin is an international attorney who had experience with previous mass atrocities. And he's in and around the UN, this time it's in New York, and he comes up with this term because there was nothing out there to identify what the Nazis had done. So he takes a Latin term and a Greek term and combines them and actually invents the term genocide. And then there are these stories of Lemkin sleeping on the representatives of the brand new UN, sleeping in their office doorsteps and being there, an extensive lobbying campaign for about 2 years, saying, this is the crime, and we have to pass a law, a resolution saying, identifying this, naming this crime, and saying it's illegal. And he was successful, and I wish I should have brought in some footage, but there is some footage of the moment in which they figure out that there's an affirmative vote in the UN General Assembly for the term genocide and the Genocide Convention. It becomes an international treaty. Countries sign on to it. It provides legal obligation. Remember I said international law provides rights to countries and also obligations. Under the Genocide Convention, it is one of those ones where you are obligated. Again, I'll say that. If you are a signatory to the Genocide Convention, you are obligated as a country to act in cases of genocide. Now, whether that happens is a different story, but international law mandates that. Notice the US doesn't ratify that until 1988, so we are not an early signatory. All right, I don't want you to read this, please don't read this site, but this is part of the Genocide Convention. I want to point out something called mens rea. So for those of you who study law, mens rea refers to intent. So just like at the domestic level, if you're held up on capital crimes or murder one, the prosecutor has to establish that you were deliberate. Mens rea, deliberate attempt to do these crimes. So at the global level, if you're accused of genocide, there has to be evidence of mens rea, that it was a deliberate campaign. I will tell you that legal threshold is very high. It's a tough one to meet. I have one particular clause outlined right there. This is a really interesting one if you think about the crimes, the accusations against Vladimir Putin and one of his peers. It has to do with children and the forcible movement of children from Ukraine into Russia. So just be mindful of that, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. So we passed this, we have this moment, 1948, the creation of the Genocide Convention, very exciting moment. Again, so simple. Pass the law, implement the law, right? It should just happen that way. Again, not so simple. These are a list of what most define as genocide. Some of them are a little bit more mass atrocities or ethnic cleansings that we have seen since the passage of the Genocide Convention. So we know that the application of this is both selective and accusations and trials of places that have had mass atrocities that are either ethnic cleansing or genocide has been problematic. All right, I want to pause for a second because there is progress along this line. Even though we have situations in which nothing has been done, there has been movement. I want to call your attention to two different things. One, immediately following the Persian Gulf War in 1991, some of you may or may not remember what happened after the war, not during the war, but immediately after the war. There's a Kurdish refugee crisis that happens in northern Iraq. Saddam Hussein retaliates against an uprising in northern Iraq. There are about 2 million Kurds that flee. They're trying to get into Turkey. They're trying to get into Syria. They're trying to get into Iran. Some countries won't let them in. The Bush administration at the time is like, we're not involved in a domestic situation in Iran. We're not there. This is the first Bush administration in the Persian Gulf War saying, yeah, we're not there talking about regime change. We're not going to get involved. CNN was on the ground. Remember when CNN was the only cable news network out there? They were covering it. The Bush administration got huge backlash at home and said, okay, fine, we'll do something. They go to the UN, look at the date, 1991. The Russians are falling apart. The Soviet Union is falling apart. They are in disarray. They said, we have to go do something. And so they passed UN Security Resolution 688, authorizing use of force for the protection of human rights. The first time in UN history when the United Nations Security Council says human rights are a threat to international peace and security. And we actually are going to interrupt Iraq's sovereignty. Iraq isn't sovereign because it's attacking its people. This is a moment. So UN Security Council Resolution 688 is a really interesting and important moment that says you can't do this to your people. However, just a few years later, we have Rwanda, 1994. April of 1994, we're coming up on the anniversary. You have this widespread systemic genocide. There was genocidal violence and rhetoric. Prior to that, the UN was actually on the ground documenting. The head of the UN peacekeeping operation, Romeo Tulare, sent letters and letters and letters back to the Security Council saying, please, please, I think something horrible is about to happen. Indeed, it does. The U.S. has no taste whatsoever for engagement in Rwanda. Remember, the Clinton administration inherits Somalia, and things go very, very bad in Somalia. If you remember the Black Hawk Down incident, the Clinton administration in April 1994, the Clinton administration actually says, we are not, remember, we are now signatories, the United States is now a signatory of the Genocide Convention, and they say, oh no, we both have an obligation, so they try to find a loophole, and they say acts of genocide may be occurring, but this is not a genocide, and therefore does not trigger the legal parameters of the Genocide Convention. After the genocide. Clinton actually goes back and lands in Bengali for about 20 minutes and apologizes, but that's besides the point. Says we shouldn't call these things, we should have called these things by their right names. Anyway, so afterwards, and this is a really interesting thing, and it is debatable about whether, quote, justice was done in Rwanda, but one of the things that's fascinating to me is the levels of justice. So they do create a Nuremberg-like court. Again, they have to find a building, they have to find judges, they have to pay these people, they have to have clerks, they have to have all of the infrastructure to bring people who organize this violence, right? That's a lot of work. But we also see the national court system get involved and put together, try to bring people accused of genocide to courts. And then there's actually a very local court system called the Chacha that's used. So I want to talk a little bit about each of those three. International Court Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Again, like the Nuremberg trials, I love to look at these numbers. I think it's really important to look at those numbers. How many are sentences? How many are acquitted? And the acquittal number is really, really important. I was just looking at January 6th numbers for those people who have been brought up on crimes around the events of January 6th in this country, those people who have been accused, those people who have been acquitted. You want to see acquitted numbers because it shows you that these are authentic trials, that there are places in which the evidence isn't compelling, and there were people that said, not enough evidence. So it shows a robust and more fair process. So the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda is the success story. There was reaction to the genocide. At the national level, the country, and again, many will claim this is Victor's war, right? So the Tutsi-led RFP comes in and Paul Kagame takes over, and they round up about 100,000 people that they think were participants in this particular, although the national court system, and again, I would call your attention to capacity. They didn't have a lot of ability to process these people, and many people, the prison situation was awful, and so one of the things they do is what they call courts on Nebraska Chacha. These are also controversial. Some people said that they were re-education centers, right? These were opportunities to re-educate the population, but at the same time, there's a process at the local level, there's a process at the national level, and a process at the international level. Moving on, I know I'm going very quickly, we see a similar thing after Bosnia and Kosovo and the violence that we see from 96 to 99 in the former Yugoslavia. Again, the UN Security Council passes a resolution. They create this ad hoc tribunal. They're going to create a court, find a building, find some attorneys, find some judges, pay for all these things. There's a lot of criticism around this particular one in that it took over a year to get organized. The Russians didn't like it for a variety of reasons. The Americans didn't want to pay for it for a variety of reasons. There was a lot of concern, and I don't have that up there, but there was a lot of concern, and this is a fascinating thing when we talk about global justice, that the justice process would interrupt the peace process on the ground in places like Kosovo and Macedonia, right? So what's going on up here would trigger retaliation on the ground. So it's something you have to think about. And there were many that said, well, the Americans in particular, they had, quote, won Kosovo. What they had won was rubble and shambles, but they had won it. And there, again, debate. Do you want to just hand these guys over to some neutral judges? The Americans want to own that, they want to punish them. Right, so there's problems. You don't know what's going to happen if you hand them over to a global or an international neutral process. So, one of the primary organizers of the violence within Kosovo was Slobodan Milosevic. He actually is brought through this particular process. He's one of the few that come through, but he dies awaiting trial. But there is a success story, so Milosevic is usually seen as a success story. All right, one other thing, just a side note. After Rwanda, after Bosnia, after Kosovo, the international community gets together in 2001, before the events of September 11th, obviously, and says, we can't do this anymore. And they change, they have a new idea, again, based from an Australian Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, excuse me, his name's Gareth Evans, and they said, you know what, let's have a conference and let's talk about it. And they established this doctrine, RGP, responsibility to protect. Basically says the international community cannot sit with its hands in its pockets, shaking its head, going tisk, 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 if mass atrocities are going on in another country. We have a responsibility to protect. We have a responsibility to react. We have a responsibility to rebuild. Think about rebuild after Kosovo and the bombing campaign there, but that was part of that particular context. So this is something that's going along parallel to justice. UN, in the Libyan case, and some of you will remember Libya, March 17th, authorization of use of force for the protection of human rights in Libya, 2011. It's one of the premier examples of using this doctrine, R2P, responsibility to protect civilian populations, and to authorize that. So it's just a very interesting thing. At the global level, it's seen as a success story of the implementation of that norm. Of course, within the United States, it is not seen as a success story because of the attacks on the U.S. Embassy and the deaths of the U.S. ambassador, and then also the fact that Libya has not transitioned through that in any way whatsoever. All right. So there's problems with tribunals. They're ad hoc. You have to build them as you fly them. Great powers have to be there. They have to be present. They have the resources. They have the money. They have the funds. Sometimes they show up. Sometimes they don't. You have to have judges. You have to have facilities. And then sometimes there's controversy over whose laws are you going to draw from. There's this hodgepodge of international law. Lots of concerns, as I just mentioned, about disruption of peace efforts. It can be incredibly slow, and it takes enormous political will. So building and flying these ad hoc tribunals is tough. So what they did in 2001, 2002 is establish the International Criminal Court. I like their graphic. It came directly from their website. I thought it was good enough to use here. Today, it's called the Rome Statute. And in the Rome Statute, they actually codified, which means they made mass atrocities illegal. So now it is illegal to commit mass atrocities, it is illegal to commit genocide, and it is illegal to commit war crimes. The ICC deals with those three crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity. So those three are its jurisdiction. It has 123 member states. The United States does not like the ICC. We have thought about it and backed away from it under the George W. Bush administration. The George W. Bush administration actually signed bilateral treaties with countries promising that they would never, the countries that were members of the ICC, promising that they would never bring the U.S. up on any charges of war crimes or any of these things. The Trump administration got very grumpy with them as well, you can see, and actually put sanctions against the chief prosecutor of the ICC, again, very concerned about war crimes in Afghanistan. So really interesting, and we'll talk about war crimes, crimes against humanity. This is interesting. Burundi, there are some African states. South Africa has claimed that it's going to withdraw. It hasn't yet. Burundi actually withdrew. The Philippines withdrew. So there's two countries that came in and then were grumpy with it and withdrew. All right. Quickly, this takes us to today. This takes us to February of 2022, when I was watching, many of us were, the deliberations in the UN Security Council. I remember watching that night, the split screen all of a sudden pops up. They're talking about the fact that Russia has massed troops on the border. They're trying to deal with this, what they think is a threat to international peace and security. And while they are deliberating, in one of the darkest moments for the UN and in our modern history, the Russian planes and bombs and aerial campaign and naval campaigns start. UN Security Council puts forward a resolution condemning the violence, and as I told you, Russia has a veto. One veto, it's gone. Russia vetoes it. So Security Council is paralyzed to deal with anything regarding mass atrocities, regarding war crimes, anything like that. However, it goes to the General Assembly. The General Assembly actually passes a resolution. Very interesting. We can go back to these if you want during Q&A. 141 in favor of condemning Russia in terms of its incursion into Ukraine. We can talk about those who voted against and the abstentions if you want in Q&A. This is just the same data in a map form that I thought was really interesting. It kind of gives you a geographic perspective on where people voted. Another thing that's really interesting is in March of that year and then in May, this is a powerful, powerful moment when you have the Russian ambassador appearing in front of the UN Human Rights Council. You have this massive walkout where the members of the council got up, while he was being walked out. You also have the UN, and I'll go forward here, the UN General Assembly votes to suspend Russia's membership in the Human Rights Council. So this is another kind of really interesting geographic of the suspension of Russia. And then very recently, this month, you have the International Criminal Court bring up charges against Vladimir Putin. There are the allegations right now are on illegal transfer of children into Russia. However, there is significant documentation, and the list is there. We can talk about particular cities, particular mass graves that have been revealed, hospitals bombed, child care facilities bombed. So we have significant both visual evidence and lots of people on the ground documenting these crimes against civilians. The International Court of Justice that we also talked about actually passed something calling on Russia to immediately cease its operations. The interesting thing about the ICJ order, it's very clear. It says this is what you should do. Guess who would implement that? That would be the UN Security Council, and again, Russia vetoes it. So real quickly, Russia, just for fun, just to let you know, give you an insight into what's going on next month, Russia takes presidency of the UN Security Council. So we've got that to look forward to. So just be aware that that's April. That's just in a few days. All right, so my conclusions. There is good news. We have normative incremental expansion of ideas. The war crimes beyond just what countries do to each other in war, that human beings should be protected, that civilians should be protected. They also built infrastructure. We have things like the International Criminal Court now that can prosecute individuals for crime. All very good news. In addition, and we can talk about this in Q&A if you want, there's a notion that justice should go beyond just punishment, that justice should be restorative, that maybe there should be reparations involved, that there's beyond just what's happening up in The Hague in the Netherlands, that maybe the people in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Sudan need to have some justice on their own, right? All very good news. The bad news, and of course the good, the bad, the ugly, thank you, an old Western. The bad news is that there are persistent violations even though those norms are there, right? It's not enough to pass the law. It's not enough to build the ICC. It's not enough to create the institutions. Countries will find a way to invade. And the next slide is probably the most controversial, but I think it must be said that we have come to this conversation with our own assumptions, our own normative assumptions, that democracies don't commit these things. That Western countries, like the United States and European countries, are promoters of norms, promoters of law, and that we ourselves are not violators. Unfortunately, there are cases, and we can talk about them if you want, in which democracies cloud themselves, wrap themselves in their own rhetoric and the shroud of international law and rule of law, and don't hold themselves accountable, right? And we can talk about them if you want. There's a scholar, Bustos, who talks about dark legality, and we see lots of places where countries are using law to perpetuate violations of human rights, and many of those countries are actually democracies. I hope you understand from this conversation that we can talk about justice, but it's highly political, in some cases it's subjective, and sometimes it's important to put the mirror up to ourselves and think about, is this cultural imperialism? Is this contradictory? What are the paradoxes? Thank you.
A lot of the countries that you listed initially, I have a program, so I apologize for not taking out.
No.
Were really civil war in nature, sort of. Okay? That probably cannot be said except in Putin's mind about what's going on today. People that I've spoken to, friends of mine in various places, think that the UN is a failure because of what is currently happening, where this is clearly not civil war in nature, clearly when you say one country invading another with total disregard of what you started off by talking about, of sovereignty. So I'm just curious what you...
Well, as a student of the UN, I mean, there's a great scholar, his name is Tom Weiss, and he's written a couple of versions of this book called What's Wrong with the UN and How to Fix It, right? So we know that the UN is a very troubled organization. I will say a couple things. It has done good things. It has done very good things. There's an alumni at UNH, his name is Martin Kamani. He is now the UN ambassador from Kenya. He's sitting on the Security Council at this particular time. He gave an incredible speech. I will ask you to Google Kamani and that particular speech. I had the great pleasure of having a conversation recently with Martin Kamani, the ambassador, and he said, you know, if your community is wiped out, it is the UN that shows up. If you have, and he is Kenyan, and he will talk over and over and over again about his engagement with the UN as something very, very positive, right? On the ground, whether or not it's UNDP or, you know, UN High Commissioner for Refugees or all of these things. So UN is many, many things. It's an organization of organizations. Actually, let's just look. This is just in terms of human rights. There are many, many pieces of the UN out there. So for me to generalize that the Security Council is gridlocked and highly problematic, I will absolutely agree with that. Doesn't mean that the institution as a whole is highly problematic. There are times in which it has worked. There are times in which it has functioned. To take the counterfactual, though, what if we get rid of it? There was no political will out there that would recreate this thing today. There's absolutely no way that work could get done. There was a moment in time when the bombs were still flying in April of 1945 that countries were willing to compromise. That this is not that time. And the UN Security Council works the worst when we have great power politics. And right now we see Russia, a resurgent Russia, a surging China. I mean, the Chinese actually think the UN is quite good. They're running as many people as they can to the UN as possible. And they're engaged in so many different institutions. So one of the criticisms that people say, I said, well, I mean, we could give it up, but then it's going to be an institution that benefits the Chinese. Or it can be one that privileges the United States, and it does. It absolutely, the whole world comes to New York. So, I mean, I don't know if I answered your question, but it is highly problematic.
Except, and again, we in the United States are assuming that which we see on our televisions are factual, that which the Russians see is not. And again, as you said, the winner's record is unfortunate. Assuming that what we see is true, not doing a great job.
Yeah, it's interesting on that point. So when Russia had the last presidency, it was February of 2022. And they argued, of course, that there is genocide in Ukraine. And that they have to go in because of the genocide in Ukraine. And that they are protecting human rights. And they actually are using the language of RGP, responsibility to protect, and taking a cue from the Clinton administration and NATO and the bombing campaign of Kosovo, right? In which the UN Secretary General said it's illegal but legitimate. So their narrative is all this. Going back to that ICJ ruling, where did I say? That ICJ ruling, one of the justices said, even if that was true though, Russia, one, we don't have any evidence of genocide. So in some ways these institutions are doing very well in terms of truth-keeping, right? So the ICJ is saying, okay, let's go look for this documentation. Where's the documentation of Ukrainian genocide? We didn't find any, right? The UN is on the ground right now. Ukraine also doing that data collection, truth-keeping, trying to keep that compass there. The other thing that judge said was that even if it was genocide, these interventions need to be legal and multilateral, meaning many countries going in. One country can't just raise its hand and say, oh, I'm going to invade you, you're doing genocide. That's not appropriate. So these have to be global actions, multilateral operations. I think there's a question.
We understand the Security Council, 5 members, veto absolute. heard that there were provisions that one of those 5 members could be set aside in certain situations, that it wasn't necessarily foolproof.
So as I understand it, and I've spent a lot of time looking at it, one, I'll tell you something that's new, and two, I'll tell you what I know. There is a provision within the UN Charter that if you are party to a conflict, you are supposed to recuse yourself. Remember, it's a gentleman's club. The U.S. has never recused itself, and the Russians never recused themselves.
I actually have a relative one that if the security, United for Peace resolution.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So if the Security Council is deadlocked and cannot handle a security issue, then it can go to General Assembly.
Yes.
So how about going in that direction? Although I love that you showed the world map, and we kind of get the impression that world is behind Ukraine. Not that much, not the way we imagine. So I don't know what you think about the possibility of uniting for peace.
Yeah, so what she's talking about is a resolution that was passed during the Cold War, again, when there was gridlock in the Security Council. It went then to the General Assembly. The problem is the General Assembly can't pass a resolution. There's no veto. Russia doesn't have a veto there. The U.S. doesn't have a veto. One country, one vote. However, the ability to implement the resolution is problematic, right? They don't have it. I will tell you, so last time I saw the ambassador, he was kind of skipping around, which ambassadors don't normally do, and he was delighted. So immediately after the veto from Russia, the UN ambassador from Liechtenstein, of all places, has had something in his back pocket that the General Assembly has just adopted, which is if there is a veto, and going forward, the General Assembly has adopted this, if there is a veto, then the matter goes to the General Assembly. So it's a way, it's like a calling to the carpet, like you would see, for example, the British Prime Minister, where there is some accountability. You have to say, you can't just veto, drop everything, and walk out the door, right? There is some level of accountability. And so evidently the ambassador from Liechtenstein has been holding on to this resolution for about 20 years and saw a movement, and it has passed. So it's too soon to see whether or not it's going to have an impact or not. The other thing that's really interesting is there is a lot of, and I don't know how far this is going to go, but there are technical elements in which Russia actually had never applied for membership into the United Nations. The founding member was the USSR, right? Russia, the USSR falls apart, and there are many Ukrainians in particular, and many people that care about you, who are petitioning very, very hard to basically suspend the membership of Russia because it is actually not a full member, it is a Soviet. So there's some legal finagling that's going around trying to deal with these things.
Can you talk a little bit about the countries that are staying in this world? That is how it's on that.
Yeah, this is such an interesting map, right? Very, very interesting. So there are consistent, you would see several of these are consistent, right? That fit in the Russian category. So, but the abstentions like South Africa, that's a really interesting one. Pakistan, Madagascar, Mali, some of these. Now, some of them are, in my understanding of those abstentions come from a couple, not all countries are abstaining for the right reason, for the same reason, right? There are some of these African countries, my understanding is that the Chinese leaned heavily on them because of the financial relationship between the Chinese and those particular countries to abstain, right? I told you Chinese are very active these days in the UN. There are others, though, also that this feels like a Cold War hangover. So you remember during the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans wanted, you had to ally with us against us. And there were countries, and there was actually a whole movement within the UN called the non-allied movement that basically said, we're not going to do this. We're not going to sit here and be either pro-Soviet or pro-US. And this is about our sovereignty and our independence, and we have a right to not be aligned. So there's a couple of countries out there that are saying, we don't want to be aligned. There's a couple of countries that are, and this speaks to the greater political environment, and I mean, it's so interesting to talk to other political scientists right now. I just read something the other day that argues that we are now in Cold War 2.0, and that we are in a situation where we have Russia, China, Russia, Iran, some of these countries firmly aligned, and that they are working very carefully on that. And that there are some countries are strategically oriented, waiting to see what the other team might offer, right? So there are leverages that might be obtained by an abstention that then could be rewarded later. So that's my understanding of the three different pieces. There's one more, and I heard this from one European country that just said, and this was a European, one of the Nordic states that talks about process, and said that they needed more, and again, this goes to this really interesting legal argument, that they needed more evidence. That they wanted, I mean, yes, there's visual evidence, yes, we have the news, but they want the process, the due process, where the evidence is actually formally prepared and laid out in an appropriate venue, and that they thought it was too early to make those allegations. I mean, you can make the allegations, but to make the conclusions because the due process hadn't gone through. So that's another explanation I've heard.
There's 180 in the favor, against, and abstentions. You've got Eswatini. I'm sorry, yeah, 180 if you add those up. So there's like Uzbekistan, Venezuela, Eswatini, Ethiopia. What did they do? Or didn't they do? Or don't they come as an abstention? What is the situation now?
Well, they just don't come. They don't show up, right?
Oh, okay.
And so, and some of those countries, like Togo, I don't know about Turkmenistan, but we had the privilege once we represented my proudest academic accomplishment is that I'm faculty advisor for Lyon. It is the most fun I have. And we happened one year to represent Rwanda. We were at the Rwandan mission briefing with the students, and I remember the ambassador, and sometimes you go to the missions and with the students, and you don't meet the ambassador, you just meet staff, and they kind of brief you. But in Rwanda's case, there was a delegation of 6. This must have been, I don't know, 15 years ago. 6 people working, representing Rwanda, and they pointed out how incredibly expensive and time-consuming that they have to have offices in New York, in Manhattan, that they have to, pay for people to live in Manhattan full-time. So there are countries out there that are members that don't have full-time offices. So you'll know that there's usually opening ceremonies of General Assembly in September. That's when you tend to see everybody in town. So some people are just not in town. I don't know what's going on with for example, Uzbekistan and such. Sometimes it's easier just to not show up. Yeah.
What do you think about it? Not likely that Putin will go to the trial, but if it happens, and we show the Genocide Convention, and it fits perfectly, but the discussion is focusing on war crimes, not the genocide. So that high threshold we were talking about, could you expand on it a little bit?
Absolutely. So one piece of this is, so there's a warrant out for Putin's arrest. One, will he be arrested? I'm going to say it's highly unlikely, right? So there is a similar head of state, Bashir of Sudan, that was also brought up on arrest warrant. He actually went to South Africa. Interestingly enough, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are meeting in South Africa again pretty soon. Bashir goes into South Africa. South Africa is a member state of the ICC, and South Africa was legally obliged to extradite, to capture Bashir and extradite him up to The Hague. South Africa said, we're not going to do it. They have their sovereign country. They can do what they can. So in that particular case, we have an example of a country who is a member of the ICC getting a hold of this leader and then saying, yeah, we're not going to comply. And nobody can force them to, right? So there's that one particular case. Would bring up the Genocide Convention, bringing up charges of genocide, because you have to establish that mens rea. So that deliberate targeting and all of that documentation that we find in the Nuremberg trials with the Nazis, which of course would come up on genocide crimes, because it didn't exist, right? The term doesn't exist at that. That's a great case in which one could apply that because of deliberation. Putin horrendous things, but to establish that there's a deliberate attempt to eliminate the Ukrainian population, that would be a very tough call. So, war crimes would be a lower threshold, and crimes against humanity a lower threshold.
Well, what about transfer of children of the group to another group? Children of Ukraine. Putin is on TV showing his children. I mean, what can be done about that?
Well, and there are other courts available, right? So there is conversation about, rather than, and the ICC has brought up these charges, and there are people that are saying it's actually not a good thing. And the reason they're saying that is because at some point there's going to be need for a peace agreement, one would hope, and that the U.S. and the Western countries have lost their leverage, or others will say, no, there is leverage now, but the U.S., remember, is not a member of the ICC, so we don't have much influence there, but there's concern about it interfering with the political process to demobilization of the crowd, so I'll just say that there. There's others that say, because the U.S. is not a member, and because the Russians are not a member of the ICC, maybe they need to create an ad hoc tribunal just for the crimes committed in Ukraine. And so there's conversation about that. Again, the Security Council would create such an entity. So back to UN Security Council, the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, it's something the Security Council would have to create. I don't see Russia saying, yes, let's create this trial. That's a problem. There are also other venues, right? So there are trials being held in Ukraine against Ukrainian soldiers who have been captured, right? So these are mid-level, right? It's not the crime of leadership, but they're mid-level. And then there are also conversations about the European Court of Justice, which might be an opportunity to prosecute as well. So there is venue shopping going on. People are thinking about the implications of different things. From my perspective, Putin's world is getting very small because of the ICC. And I think that's a good thing.
I think you touched briefly on Rwanda. I recall something about Paul Kachanga, someone who was involved in a more local sort of court or sort of not re-education but reunification. And could you touch on that again? I think he brought people together to discuss with each other within the communities, people who had, killed their neighbor, to talk about, guilt and to absolve each other, basically.
Excellent. So thank you for asking me about that. So this is an image of the national prison. So within Rwanda, they realized that there was no way that they didn't have the infrastructure, right? They don't have the capacity to prosecute. Think about just, I don't know how many of you have been to traffic court any time in the last 10 years. It wasn't a come-in judge. That's an all-day commitment if you have a situation. So think about allegations like this. So they realized that they didn't have those capacities. Within the Rwandan cultural system, they have these courts on the grass, the gacaca, where usually, and some of this reminds me a lot of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Where your neighbor may have killed your father. And your neighbor's there, and you're there, and this is a post-conflict situation. So one of the things that the gacaca did well is it processed communities. It gave a venue for local communities in their way to come together, make allegations, have confessions. The gacaca process is one in which people confess to crimes and say, I did this, with low stakes, right? So oftentimes community service, or even just the statement. For those looking at what we call restorative justice, there's a whole field out there about justice beyond punishment, justice to bring communities to a place of healing, long-term looking at this. That truth and reconciliation process, the truth piece, is a really essential piece of this. Understanding, okay, what happened, and there are often many different versions, as we see in Ukraine, and whether or not Ukraine's committing genocide or Russia's creating, so that particular piece is really, really important. And and then having some process, right? So think about Nazi Germany. Thousands and thousands of people that worked in concentration camps,